So with that, why don't we get started with today's main event. For those of you I don't know, my name is Brian Levy, and along with many others really in Mendoza, and where's Brett? Brett Beasley here, and really sort of the cast of thousands I have responsibility for Ethics Week. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Mendoza College of Business, the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership, Chase Bank. This is our 22nd annual Ethics Week, and some years we have a theme, some years we don't. We just invite interesting speakers on a variety of different topics. But this year's theme is economic inequality on campuses, in communities, and at companies. And today is the at companies part. Some fun facts, and forgive me for reading these, and I got this first one from Brett. Last year, Mattel CEO made 4,987 times more than a rank-and-file employee at the same company. A Walmart employee earning the company's median salary would have to work more than 1,000 years to earn the $22 million that the company's CEO made. How did we get here? Well, that sort of gets us to today's speaker. He is Stephen Clifford. He is the author of The CEO Pay Machine, How It Trashes America and How to Stop It. He's going to give us a little bit of a history lesson about CEO pay, tell us where we are now, and maybe give us kind of the events point, how to change things in the future, some solutions going forward. I'm not going to read his bio, as impressive as it is. It's on the Mendoza website. You should read it. You'll be impressed, and you'll say, wow, what have I done lately? Okay, it's sort of daunting. What I will say is he is a former CEO, and he has been on too many boards, corporate boards to name, and in particular compensation committees. So to some extent, he is in the CEO club and outing his own. So with that, please join me in welcoming Stephen Clifford.
Well, thank you for coming on such a glorious South Bend day. I imagine most of you would want to be outdoors, but thank you for coming here. I will be talking for about 40 minutes on CEO pay, and then take questions and answers. Hold on, I've got to get my notes here. I was a CEO for 14 years. When I retired, I wanted to keep my hand in somewhat, so I waggled my way on a number of corporate boards. A couple of those asked me to chair the compensation committee. Now, this isn't really much of an honor because in corporate America, it's well known that the second dumbest director chairs compensation because they want to save the dumbest director to chair, the second dumbest director chairs audit because they want to save the dumbest for chairing compensation. Now, these were not Fortune 500 companies like I write about in my book, but they used the same system and the same pay consultants to set CEO pay. So I got to look at this system, which I call the pay machine, from the inside, and after the first year of going through it, I said, this is nuts. This doesn't make any sense. I mean, not only did it overpay the CEO, that was a minor problem. I didn't mind that. It pushed the CEO in the wrong direction. Very, very short-term direction. Made him, and by the way, when I'm talking about CEOs today, I'll be talking about CEOs of the S&P 500, the 500 largest companies, publicly traded companies in America. And also, I'm going to use the male pronoun rather than constantly repeating he and she. 95% of these guys are men, and given what I have to say about them, I hope the women in the audience will understand. So I began to try and change the system. I started to do some research on it. And I came to the conclusion that it was hurting the companies that was using it. It was impairing performance. And it was also hurting America. It was hurting the economy, and it was driving inequality. So being unemployed, I decided I'd write a book about it. Now, first, I want you to know that I'm a capitalist. I believe in free markets. And I believe that capitalism with enough of a regulatory touch to assure that markets are in fact free is probably the best economic system that man has found yet. I criticize CEO pay because it has nothing to do with free markets. It's not a market, as we'll see today. It's a rigged, administered system. And I don't think it's doing capitalism any good. As a matter of fact, I think it's doing quite a bit of harm. So, 2017, the average CEO, and again I'm talking S&P 500, made $14 million. And that excludes the money from exercising stock options and the money they receive when restricted stock vests. If you include those, it's north of $20 million. But, you know, athletes, movie stars, they make a lot of money too. So why am I picking on CEOs? Well, two reasons. First, supply and demand really determines how much an athlete or a movie star will make. Movie studios and sports teams bid for their services in somewhat of an auction market. As I will show you today, CEO pay has absolutely nothing to do with a market. It's a rigged system. Second, no matter how much athletes and movie stars make, they're really not hurting anybody. I mean, if they made less, the team owners and the movie studios would just make more. They wouldn't reduce their prices because their prices are determined by ticket supply and ticket demand. They're not determined by their cost structure. CEOs, however, are taking money that rightfully belongs mostly to the shareholders and some to the employees. Now, today, the average CEO makes 361 times what the median employee makes. That is not the consequence of a modern, globalized economy. In Japan, that number is 16. In America, in 1978, it was 26. At the most respected institution in the United States, the U.S. military, it's less than 5. So when you look at that, you have to conclude that either today's American CEOs are 20 times better than their Japanese counterparts, or 80 times more valuable than the members of the Joint Chief of Staffs, or something's gone terribly wrong. I'm in the group opinion that something's gone terribly wrong. So today I want to cover first, how did this happen? Second, what are the consequences? And third, what can we do about it? How did this happen? Before 1980, CEOs were paid pretty much like everybody else. They got an annual raise that was about equal to what everybody else made. Now here's a graph of the CEO pay ratio. I think it ends in 2014, and it's crept a little higher now. It's north of the 350. So from 1945 to basically to 1980 or so, the CEO pay ratio stayed very stable at about 25 to 30. They got the same amount of raises that everybody else got. Then what happened is you got corporate pay consultants that came in, and they introduced a series of practices and procedures that I call the pay machine. And they started introducing them in the mid-'80s, and that's when you see things taking off in that pay ratio. Now, I don't have time, it's a very complicated system. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but I'm going to go through 3 major parts. And those parts are peer groups, benchmarking, and bonus targets and ranges. Now, when the pay consultants came in, they told the companies they had data on what other CEOs were being paid because they were their clients. So they told the companies, look, you're doing the CEO pay thing all wrong. You're basing it on internal equity. You're basing the CEO pay on, it should be 150% of what a vice president makes or something like that. And that's all wrong. What you need to do is base it on what other CEOs make, external equity. Now, there was no theoretical justification for this. There was no evidence that ever produced or would produce any better outcomes. But switching to external equity worked very, very well for three groups: the CEOs, the boards, and the consultants. And they were the only three people involved in the decision. So this thing quickly spread. And so the first step in paying a CEO is the company determines its peer group. It selects the companies that it thinks are comparable in size, difficulty of management, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you'll be shocked to learn that companies always pick as peer groups companies that have very, very highly paid CEOs. This happens all the time. So in my book, I gave one case, and this is the peer group for United Health Group, health insurer. Their peers: American Express, Apple, Bank of America, Cisco, Citigroup, Coca-Cola, Costco, Dow Chemical, General Electric, Goldman Sachs, Google, and I'm only a quarter way through the alphabet. Now, this CEO had worked for two companies his entire life: an accounting firm and group health. I'm sorry, accounting firm and United Health. Apple wasn't going to hire him. He knew nothing about technology. Goldman Sachs wasn't going to hire him. He knew nothing about investment banking and bond trading. Google wasn't going to hire him. He knew nothing about search analytics. In fact, none of the companies I just talked would ever consider hiring this person who had absolutely no industry experience. So whatever they were paying is totally irrelevant to what United Health should be paying. Now, CEO competence, it turns out, is largely industry and company specific. To be an effective CEO, you need to know a tremendous amount about a single company. You need to understand its personnel, its finances, its culture, its board politics, its supply chain, its distribution system, et cetera, et cetera. That is absolutely essential to run that company. However, that knowledge is not much use outside that company. So CEOs aren't like LeBron James, who can go, any basketball team he plays on, he's going to improve. Or Meryl Streep, any movie she's in, she's going to improve. Most CEOs would not improve another company. This is why companies don't bid for CEOs. 3/4 of all CEOs are internal promotions. Less than 2% of CEOs of the S&P 500 were previously CEO of another publicly traded company. Jumps between companies at the CEO level happens less than once a year, and when they jump, they usually fail. They're more than twice as likely to be fired as the internal promotion. Given that, companies aren't bidding for these people. I've always heard, oh, well, you have to pay them or they'll go across the street. No, they won't go across the street. The street's in a different business. And it's not bidding for these people. So the first step, which is this peer group, one of the foundational steps of the how CEO pays, has absolutely no justification. So let's go through the process. Okay, we start with this peer group. And let's say in this example, the median CEO pay is $15 million. So does this mean this CEO gets $15 million? No, because the second step in the process is you got to benchmark. The theory is, well, an outstanding company should pay more than the average. And how do you determine you're an outstanding company? Well, the board just decides whether they're an outstanding company or not. There's never any test, any metric that it decides. So what happens is that the board decides that all CEOs live in Lake Wobegon. every company that I've worked with, been on the board of, or researched, pegged its CEO either at the 50th, 75th, or 90th percentile for its pay. So on average CEOs are all pegged at the 75th percentile, which leads to some interesting things down the road. And as I say, they don't have to do anything. In my book, I look at 5 CEOs who were the highest paid from 2011 to 2015. They were all benchmarked above the 75th percentile. They didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to beat 75% of their peer group at anything. They didn't have to achieve anything. They were just, we're a good company. We pay at 75th percentile for CEOs, not for other employees, by the way. So CEO starts at, as I said, with highly paid peers. It's going to be paid $15 million. Then he gets pegged at the 75th percentile, so now he's going to make $20 million. But 20 million's only the target, because the real guts of this system is pay for performance. You open any 10K that explains CEO pay, and they all have about 20 pages on this. You will read pay for performance about 30 times in each 10K. It sounds great that we only pay for performance. But to implement that, you have to decide some kind of metrics, how those metrics work. And when you put this together, the CEO beats his target about 85% of the time. For example, in my book, in the 2 CEOs who were highest paid in 2011-12 had targets of 9.1 million and 20 million. Their actual compensation was 102 million and 145 million, because they beat their targets. This was performance. Well, those targets have to be negotiated. They have to be set somehow. The CEO is in a very good bargaining position. The board is in a terrible bargaining position. He is negotiating with a friendly board. That board, the majority of that board are sitting CEOs and ex-CEOs who are, CEO pay goes up, not so bad for them. The CEO controls the entire information system for the company. As a matter of fact, the board gets most of its information directly from the CEO. The board has no staff, no institutional memory. The CEO is pocketing the money. The board isn't paying out of their own pocket. They're paying out of shareholder money. And on top of everything else, the CEO runs the books. So this leads to a pretty one-sided choice of metrics and negotiation. So, in our example, let's assume that he negotiates good targets. He beats them he doubles them. So he now has made 40 million. Well, now you have to look what happens. He's just made 40 million due to the compensation. So his pay now goes into the peer groups of all of his other peers. All the people that were in his peer group, they get a guy who just made 40 million back in their peer group. Well, they get a raise right away just because he made 40 million. He then gets a raise next year because they got a raise. So what you've got is this giant game of CEO leapfrog. They're just jumping, they're all at the 75th percentile, they're all above average, they're all jumping over each other. And this system has produced a 1,000% increase, real dollars, inflation adjusted, for CEOs since 1980. At the same time, the average worker has seen about 0.5% a year increase. So, the top 10 CEOs in 2017 averaged over 116 million apiece. So corporations clearly are wasting huge amounts of money here, which is kind of an anomaly because corporate boards are supposed to be watching expenses rather than throwing money away. So why do they do this? Well, I say there are 2 reasons. One thing I've learned in my career is if you expect everyone to follow their self-interest, you will seldom be disappointed. So it's in the self-interest of boards to let CEO pay get out of control. Second, they allow themselves to act delusionally. In other words, when I say delusionally, that's holding on to beliefs that are demonstrably false. And there are really four major delusions that this board has. First is a market delusion that I've talked about, that there's a competitive market here. If we don't pay top dollar, we won't get the best CEO. Second delusion is the motivation delusion. That's the delusion, again, all of these four delusions underpin this whole system. That's the delusion that bonuses, big, big bonuses, are the best and perhaps the only way to motivate a CEO. Well, CEOs are already highly motivated. You don't get to be a CEO if you're not highly motivated. The only thing a pay system can do is channel that motivation in a certain direction. And as we'll see, in this case, it channels that direction in an extremely short term. And there's actually empirical evidence that big bonuses lead to worse outcomes. And there are numerous, as I cite in my book, there are numerous studies that show that except for simple repetitive tasks, financial incentives impair performance. And they impair performance because the prospect of a big bonus, think of it, if you could make $20 million hitting an earnings per share target for a year, you would be highly, highly focused on one thing that entire year, hitting that earnings per share target. You wouldn't think of anything else. I mean, you're going to jeopardize $20 million that could go in your pocket by worrying about future product development that'll pay off in 5 years when you're no longer CEO. So what happens is the prospect of a large bonus captures your entire thinking space. It very much limits your curiosity, your creativity, and your innovation. Because those things aren't going to help with earnings per share by the end of the year. But those are the absolute qualities you need to be a good CEO. Performance delusion, that's a delusion that corporate boards can effectively measure and reward CEO performance. Well, to start with, they haven't been able to. Pearl Meyer is the leading executive consultant compensation firm. They, if anybody, would not want to publish a study that said, hey, there's no correlation between pay and performance. Yet, last October, after analyzing more than 2,000 companies, they found, quote, no correlation between CEO pay and company performance. A more comprehensive study, and I think a better study, found that the more you paid the CEO, the worse the company did in terms measured by shareholder returns over the next 3 to 5 years. So they haven't been able to do it, and they're never going to be able to do it because it's very difficult to isolate a CEO's contribution. And it's almost impossible to separate that from luck. And if you took the hardest thing, saying the only thing we care about is shareholder returns, which they don't do, that's generally about 25% of the bonus at most. But if you just said, look, your job is to get shareholder return, 75% of shareholder return depends on how the stock market's doing and how your industry's doing within the stock market. So if you're there at the right time, you're going to get a good return. If you're there at the wrong time, you're going to get a bad return. So by and large, the system ends up paying you for when Wall Street likes you, and it ends up paying you for negotiating hard, easy bonus targets with your board. Now, the last is the importance delusion. That's that the CEO he is the company, so he should get all the credit and all the rewards if the company does well. Well, first, there are some great CEOs. There are some CEOs that make a huge, huge difference. I live in Seattle, and so immediately I would think of Bill Gates, or Jeff Bezos, or Howard Schultz. Those are Those are three CEOs. They were founding CEOs. They started with a blank slate, and they wrote what the company was going to be and then implemented it. They started with nothing and built these companies, and now you wouldn't have Microsoft or Amazon or Starbucks without them. Now, incidentally, founding CEOs seldom get paid much. Larry Page at Google gets $1 a year. Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook gets $1 a year. Jeff Bezos has never gotten more than $81,000 a year. Now, they're all making huge amounts of money on their shares. You know, Jeff Bezos is the world's richest man. But he's done that all through the share appreciation, and he's not taking any money that rightfully belongs to the other shareholders. He's doing the other shareholders of Amazon have a great deal. They have Jeff Bezos working full-time for $81,000 a year. That's very different than these other CEOs who are the non-founding CEOs who are taking $100 million, 90 of which belongs to the shareholders. And the founding CEOs served for a long time. Gates was at Microsoft for 25 years. Bezos will be at Amazon longer than that. Schultz served about the same tenure at Starbucks. As opposed to that, the average CEO has a tenure of 4.6 years. Now, remember that 4.6 years, and he inherits a company that's an ocean liner going in a direction. It has all its personnel, it has all its plans, it has its culture, it has its product development cycles are in place and moving. So how much, within 4.6 years, how much difference can he make? And the other question is, at these companies, they all have a large number of talented managers, all have roughly the same background. Anytime there's a CEO opening, there are always 3 or 4 candidates who are almost equal, and it's very tough for them to choose. So how much different is one guy going to make over the other person who might be chosen? I don't think much, not much. Maybe 1%, 2%, 3%, but it's not the same. They're not doing the job that Mark Zuckerberg is doing. So I find it stunning that when you look at these big corporate boards, and these are the directors are all highly successful business people, and they're used to rigorously quantifying everything, testing everything, and analyzing everything, and then they pay their CEO based on assumptions that are demonstrably false. I give the analogy, suppose 30 years ago some insurance consultants had come to these guys, they'd come to a board and said, look, you're doing insurance all wrong. What you do is you got to look at what your competitors are paying for insurance, and then you should pay about at the 75th percentile because you're better than they are. And then we'll go out and we'll negotiate all sorts of performance metrics with your insurers, and we'll pay them for good performance. They'll be motivated to really perform well. Well, now it's 30 years later. The director looks and he says, our real cost of insurance has risen 1,000% since we hired you, and our coverage is just the same. You're fired. Now, they don't do that to their pay consultants. As I said, it's not in their self-interest. They want to keep the CEO happy. He may have asked them to join the board. Director compensation and CEO compensation are usually recommended by the same pay consultant, and they're highly correlated. And the average director fee is about $300,000, and that's, it's said that, well, nobody joins a board for the money, which is probably true, but still $300,000, a nice hunk of change. And you know you won't be asked to join another board if you're known as a hawk on CEO pay. And boards are pretty good gigs. You know you can't be held liable personally for whatever you do. Business judgment rule protects you. And there's always safety in numbers. You can say, you know, we didn't, all those other companies were irresponsible. They overpaid their CEO. They didn't give us any choice. We'd like to be responsible, but you know, we just have to go along with it. So, what are the consequences? Well, the tens of millions or hundreds of millions you waste in CEO pay is a small fraction of the total cost. A much bigger part of the cost is the effect on morale. It's been shown in numerous studies. The larger the CEO pay ratio, the worse the morale. I mean, it's very hard to sit there when the boss is making 400 times what you make and listen to him say, our associates are our most important asset. You know, there's no I in team, et cetera, et cetera. The most costly is the short-term focus. Specifically, I'll give you one example. It discourages sound investments. 85% of CEO pay comes in the form of equity. Stock options, restricted stock. Often, and you'll be cashing out in 4 years. Often, according to your bonus is shareholder return, which means stock price. So, as CEO, you've got a very high incentive to get your stock price up. Very high personal incentive. Now, there are two ways to do that. One way is to actually produce better products, better services at a lower price. That is very hard work because your competitors are trying to do the same thing, and that's very hard work, especially when you have a very easy alternative. You just buy back your own stock. That's pretty easy work. You just buy it back. Last year, S&P 500 companies exceeded $1 trillion in stock buybacks. From 2008, they've spent $5 trillion on stock buybacks. This is 53% of their net income. Meanwhile, they only reinvested 7%. Now, $5 trillion is such a hard number, such a large number, it's hard to get your head around. But think for yourself, do you think you've lived 5 trillion seconds? Well, if you had, you would be 158,000 years old. That's how big 5 trillion is. Now, that's 5 trillion that could have been invested in American industry. This is at a time when China is investing trillions of dollars in the industries of the future, artificial intelligence, biotech, etc. And we're buying back our own stock, which is essentially eating the seed corn. Now, the worst economic consequence, though, is the inequality that's driven by this. There was a time in America when productivity and wages were highly correlated. The hourly compensation in blue, productivity in brown, very tight correlation between those two from 1948 to 1973. So as productivity went up, the workers were enjoying the fruits of the increase in productivity. Well, those lines started to diverge in mid-70s. Basically, wages went flat. Productivity increased, not at the same rate as prior, but from 1980 on, it was still driving. So you have an economy that's kicking off huge amounts of cash through productivity, but it's not going to the workers. So where is it going? Well, surprise, surprise, it's going to a very small number of very rich people. This, one graph too far. This is a graph of income, including annual, including gain. Brown up here is the top 0.1%. There, since 1980, and this is all inflation adjusted, their average income quadrupled, and the 0.1% took 40% of all economic gains in the country. It's 130,000. In black, you see the rest of the 1%. The 1% less 0.1%. They did well. Their income was up about 50% over that period. And the blue is the bottom 90%. They're actually worse off today than they were in 1980. So what you've got is an economy that's distributing its money largely to the 1%, especially the 0.1%, and not to the 90%. So who are the 0.1%? Well, they're not movie stars and they're not actresses. 70% of them are business executives. Business executives whose compensation is directly or indirectly influenced by CEO pay. Now, I want to show you two graphs together here. Here I show in blue the average annual income of the 0.1%, and here in brown is the CEO pay ratio. If you look at those two, you can see that the two are very, very highly correlated. Now, correlation doesn't mean causation. So you can either argue, as I do, that CEO pay is a prime driver of this income distribution, or you can say, no, that's wrong. What happens is, as income equality increases, corporate boards sit around and say, hey, things are getting more unequal, let's raise our CEO pay. That would be the other explanation. I favor mine. Now, a capitalist economy can't function without a fair amount of pay inequality. At some point, inequality gets so high that it impedes economic growth. You could just look at, Guatemala, where 40 families own the whole company, own the whole nation, and you'll see that's not a model of economic dynamism. I don't have time here, but I argue in my book that rising inequality since 1980 has harmed economic growth. I'll just give you, and there's a lot of data to show this. The per capita GDP growth was about 20% higher in the years when CEO pay was restrained than it has been since. And I've got a lot more studies from the IMF and that in the book. And the reason that, the basic reason is that economic inequality harms the #1 economic asset, which is an educated, motivated, and competent workforce. But there are other problems with it, especially eroding trust. So, how to stop it? Well, more editorials aren't going to stop it. Really, there are only two people that can stop it. One would be the shareholders, the other would be the legislators. I've been working, trying to convince, myself and some others, trying to convince institutional shareholders that they should be voting against quite a few pay packages. Dodd-Frank says you have a non-binding shareholder vote at least every 3 years. That attempt to persuade them, I would say, has been unsuccessful to date. They have other connections with these companies. If you're a State Street bank and you're a major investor, but you're also loaning to these companies, you hardly want to come out and say, yes, CEOs are being paid too much. So I'm now working with a group, trying to get progressive legislators to reach consensus on an excise tax on excess CEO pay. If we can get that, then we can hold hearings in the House and start to promote this. I think that once boards perceive that there is a political problem here, I think they could probably reform themselves rather than having legislative action. But some action, I believe, is required because a system that serves only the 0.1% and a stable, functioning democracy simply can't coexist. I think we're in for a couple of decades of political turmoil while we decide whether we really are a democracy or we're a plutocracy that has the fig leaf of democratic institutions. So with that upbeat ending, I will be happy to take questions. Somebody's got to be first.
So I've got a question to get started with. Was there ever a time where a CEO turned down a bonus and said, you know, a CEO doesn't even make that?
You know, that was not uncommon in the 50s and 60s. As a matter of fact, George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, who was CEO of American Motors, frequently turned down bonuses because he said, you know, it's just obscene. He said, I don't need to make more than $200,000. They wanted to award him an extra $100,000 bonus, and he said, I don't need that. You know, 200,000 is plenty for me. I think you have to think of how different the culture was at that time. At that time, that was applauded. Now they'd be saying, what a moron. Well, you're turning down money. You know, I mean, so, you know, we didn't, in that time, you know, simply the making of money was not celebrated the way it is today. Yes?
Thanks for the great talk. I wanted to follow up on that, ask sort of about the culture. It seems like the trends that you point to correlate really closely as well to the rise and decline of organized labor.
Yes, yes.
And Walter Reuther, who was president of the UAW during the heyday
Right.
of organized labor and was one of Romney's
Right.
chief opponents.
Right.
He used to talk about a rigged and administered economy in terms of the way GM was able to control pricing and all this. So
Yeah.
I just wonder, can you speak to maybe the importance or the relevance of unions on this question, as well as this larger question of why the culture has shifted, right? We have the same laws really
Yeah.
from the 40s.
I would have to say with unions that under Reagan, the culture shifted. Under Reagan, it became fine to be, for a corporation to be anti-union and fighting unions, and they've been highly successful in doing so. Certainly the absence of any labor power has been one of the things that has allowed that compression of wages. I don't think there's any doubt about it. I don't think it's the only cause, but it's certainly one of the causes. But there was a time when, you know, everybody was going to get along, and that kind of stopped in 1980. Yeah.
In your previous graph, how did you measure productivity?
How did I measure productivity? I measured, I can tell you the source. It was from, it's the bank, Federal Bank in St. Louis keeps publishes annual productivity increases. And I just took it straight from them. I didn't measure it myself. Yes?
What are the major obstacles that prevent the implementation of such a policy that limits the pay?
I'm sorry?
What are the major obstacles that prevent us fixing this problem?
Well, the major obstacles are, you know, you've got a bunch of dukes and princes in place, and they're very happy doing what they're doing. And the corporate boards have no incentive to change. And, you know, unless, at some point, no scam can go on forever. You know, at some point this will end. The longer it goes on, the worse it will end. But right now, I would just say the inertia of the system and the corporate directors believe that they're doing the right thing and that they need to do this to motivate and retain talent. I think they believe it because they just keep repeating that and never look at any disconfirming data. Yeah?
You mentioned a minute ago that you're kind of like working with progressives
Yeah.
to basically like get some legislation passed and whatnot. Why pair up with progressives instead of people who are more in the center who might be able to like initiate talks between like the two parties?
Well, there's just not much reception there. You know, I've tried, as I say, I tried to talk to, I've talked personally to 5 of the 6 largest institutional investors. They should be at the center, and they should, you know, they should understand that this is their clients' money that's being wasted. They're not going to touch it. They're not going to touch it because why should, you know, why get a bunch of CEOs mad at you? So I'm afraid that people in the center, as I say, people in the center don't see this as being in their self-interest. I mean, why should you put your head above the trench and get shot?
Maybe last question over here.
Yeah.
The Tax Cut and Jobs Act
Yes.
had a excise tax on private college
Correct.
endowments and also on athletic coaches and others.
Correct.
Did that open the door for what you have?
I thought that would open the door. This he's referring to the Republican Tax Act, which decided that the big problem in CEO pay was at the nonprofits. And so they did put a 21% excise tax on all pay over $1 million a year. That was later explained to me. I thought, great, it's open door, let's apply this to for-profits. It's later explained to me that, no, the reason they did this was they stopped the deduction on, you can no longer, as a for-profit, pay over $1 million and deduct it. So they said, but the nonprofits, they don't deduct it. Don't deduct it in any case. So we should put, to make that equal, we should put an excise tax on that.
All right, well, if you'd like to learn more by the CEO pay machine, how it trashes America and how to stop it, and if you want to learn even more and you want to do something about it, come see Ben Phillips on Wednesday, March 6th at 5 p.m. Thank you, sir.